There is a question that almost nobody in mainstream financial commentary asks directly. Not what is happening to the dollar. Every outlet has covered that. Not will the yuan replace the dollar? Every economist has an opinion. Not is de-dollarization real? The data makes it impossible to deny. The question that matters, the question that explains the entire structural shift, is why? Why are countries building alternative payment systems when the existing system works? Why are central banks accumulating gold at historically unprecedented rates when dollar assets offer higher yields? Why are nations signing bilateral currency agreements when the global dollar system provides greater liquidity? Why are governments spending billions of dollars building financial infrastructure that serves as a backup to infrastructure they are already using? The answer to all four questions is the same, and it is simpler than most financial analysts make it. Because the existing system is not neutral infrastructure. It is foreign infrastructure, operated by a foreign government, subject to the policy decisions of that foreign government, convertible into an economic weapon with no warning and no appeal. Countries are not trying to escape the dollar because it is weak. Many of them are building dollar alternatives while simultaneously holding large dollar reserves. They are not doing it because they have found something better. There is currently no alternative that matches the dollar's liquidity, depth, and global acceptance. They are doing it because the rational response to any critical infrastructure dependency in technology, in energy, in logistics, in finance, is to build redundancy before you need it. The issue is no longer value, it is control. And that reframing from what is the dollar worth to who controls the system the dollar runs on is the most important conceptual shift in international finance in the last 4 years. This is Capital Briefing. If you are here for the first time, subscribe now before we continue. Turn on notifications. What we build on this channel is the translation of structural macro shifts into the framework that lets you understand what is happening before the public narrative absorbs it. Subscribe now, then let me show you exactly why the countries building dollar exits are behaving rationally, and what the infrastructure they are constructing tells us about where global finance is going. Let me start with the mechanism that is almost never explained clearly. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a messaging network. It is the system that banks use when they need to send payment instructions to each other across borders. When a business in Jakarta pays a supplier in Frankfurt, the transaction moves through SWIFT. When a central bank in Riyadh transfers reserves to New York, SWIFT is the communications layer. SWIFT is headquartered in Belgium. It is ostensibly a cooperative owned by its member financial institutions, but it operates under Belgian law and it complies with sanctions imposed by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. That compliance is the key, because SWIFT compliance with U.S. sanctions means that if the United States government designates your country, your bank, or your institution under any of its sanctions programs, your access to the global payment system is gone, not reduced, not restricted, gone, instantly. You cannot pay suppliers. You cannot receive payments from customers. Your correspondent banking relationships become inoperable because every bank that processes dollar transactions faces the choice between continuing to work with you and losing their own access to the U.S. financial system. In 2022, when the United States and its allies removed Russia from SWIFT in response to the Ukraine invasion, they demonstrated this capability at the sovereign central bank level, not individual Russian banks. The central bank of a G20 economy removed from the global payment system its $300 billion in foreign exchange reserves frozen in a matter of days. The decision to use SWIFT as a geopolitical weapon was arguably justified. That is not the point. The point is what every other country watching that sequence of events concluded, that any country, not just adversaries, but any country could find itself in a situation where its relationship with the United States deteriorates, where a policy decision in Washington creates a conflict of interest, where the administration in power makes a demand that a foreign government finds unacceptable. And in that moment, The foreign government's entire connection to global finance could be severed. U.S. sanctions programs have expanded from approximately 120 countries and entities in 2001 to more than 900 designations by 2024. The extraterritorial reach of U.S. sanctions, meaning that even non-American entities that do business with sanctioned parties can face U.S. legal action, has transformed what was once a targeted tool into a pervasive presence in every cross-border financial decision made anywhere in the world. One analyst writing for AGBI in February 2026 put the question directly to Gulf states: can they continue to anchor their currencies and park their wealth in a system where the rules no longer apply equally, where assets can be frozen on political grounds? That question is being asked and answered in finance ministries and central banks across the developing world, across the Gulf, across Southeast Asia, and increasingly across countries that consider themselves American partners. Subscribe to Capital Briefing if this framing is delivering the structural context you have been looking for. Turn on notifications. The next video on this channel examines what specific portfolio-level decisions follow from the structural analysis in this video, how individual investors and institutions can position in response to the long-term trajectory of dollar dependency reduction without making speculative bets on near-term dollar collapse. Subscribe now. Then, let me take you through the infrastructure that is being built. The most important thing to understand about the alternative financial infrastructure currently being constructed is that it is being built by rational engineers, not ideological activists. The people designing these systems are not anti-American. They are not pursuing utopian visions of a post-Western world order. They are solving a specific engineering problem. How do you build payment rails and settlement systems that function independently of the political decisions of a foreign government? That problem has a technical solution, and it is being implemented. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, is the most developed alternative to SWIFT for yuan-denominated transactions. By March 2026, it processed 750,000 transactions in a single month, with annual business volume reaching 180 trillion yuan, approximately $25 trillion. It connects 4,900 banking institutions in 187 countries. Compared to SWIFT's daily volume, CIPS processes a fraction of global transactions. But its growth trajectory, 43% annual volume growth in 2024, and its geographic reach tell a more important story than the current share. CIPS is not designed to replace SWIFT. It is designed to make yuan-denominated trade settlement possible without going through any system that requires U.S. compliance. That is a different objective, and it has significant implications for any country that wants to conduct trade with China without exposing those transactions to potential U.S. oversight or interference. Project M-Bridge is the more ambitious architecture, developed through a collaboration between the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China, and the Central Bank of the UAE, with Saudi Arabia joining in 2024. M-Bridge is a multi-central bank digital currency platform. It allows participating central banks to settle transactions directly with each other in their own currencies without involving a U.S. correspondent bank at any point in the chain. The significance of that last clause cannot be overstated. Without involving a U.S. correspondent bank at any point in the chain. If a transaction never touches a U.S. bank, it is outside the jurisdictional reach of U.S. sanctions enforcement. Not because of legal arguments or political defiance, but because of technical architecture. The transaction simply does not exist in any system that U.S. authorities have oversight over. M-Bridge reached minimal viable product stage in June 2024. By the 2026 Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, it was described as operational, with settlement happening in real time in local currencies, backed by gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. The Gulf Cooperation Council has launched AFAQ, the Gulf Instant Payment System, connecting member state banks for real-time cross-border transactions without relying on dollar-clearing banks. The GCC, whose currencies are all pegged to the dollar and whose sovereign wealth funds collectively hold trillions in dollar-denominated assets, is building payment infrastructure that works without the dollar system. India has established special rupee Vostro accounts, allowing trading partners to settle transactions directly in Indian rupees without dollar intermediation. As of August 2025, the Reserve Bank of India simplified the process by allowing banks to open these accounts without seeking prior RBI approval. At least 26 countries have established bilateral rupee settlement arrangements with India. Indonesia and China signed a memorandum of understanding in May 2025 to settle $150 billion in bilateral trade using rupiah and renminbi, specifically to reduce dependency on dollar-based settlement. China and the UAE have settled liquefied natural gas trade in yuan. India and Russia have shifted bilateral trade to rubles and rupees. China's oil trade with Iran and Russia is settled primarily in renminbi. These are not symbolic gestures. They are operational transactions in real goods, representing significant volumes of global trade flowing through channels that do not require the dollar. Now let me explain why the economic logic reinforces the geopolitical logic, because this is the element of the story that most coverage misses entirely. Countries are not just building dollar exits because of sanctions risk. They are building them because dollar dependency is economically costly in ways that have nothing to do with geopolitics. SWIFT fees for cross-border transactions typically range from 0.5 to 2% of transaction value. For a country conducting hundreds of billions in international trade annually, this is a material cost, and it accrues to an infrastructure they do not control. Bilateral currency swap arrangements reduce intermediary costs by 15 to 30% compared to dollar-intermediated transactions. China's CBDCs can reduce transaction costs by up to 50% and clear payments in seconds rather than the days that SWIFT's layered correspondent banking model requires. That is not ideology. That is basic economic efficiency. If two countries can trade directly in their own currencies, faster, cheaper, without an intermediary, the purely financial case for doing so is compelling, independent of any geopolitical consideration. The geopolitical risk creates the urgency. The economic efficiency creates the permanence. Once countries have built the infrastructure for direct currency settlement and experienced the cost savings, they have structural reasons to continue using it, even if geopolitical tensions ease. That is why the infrastructure construction matters more than the current transaction volumes. The infrastructure being built today is not going to be dismantled when the political environment changes. Let me now explain the dynamic that makes this moment historically significant. The difference between countries building alternatives and countries using alternatives. Every previous episode of de-dollarization discussion in the 1970s after 2008, during the Eurozone debt crisis, produced policy statements, summits, and proposals that generated headlines without producing durable infrastructure. What is different now is that the infrastructure is actually being built and used, not announced, not proposed, operational. The digital yuan has exceeded $2.3 trillion in transaction volume, up more than 800% since 2023. That is not a pilot program. That is a deployed payment system processing real transactions at scale. CIPS processed 180 trillion yuan in annual volume in 2025. That is infrastructure operating at scale. Enbridge completed real-value transactions between participating central banks in 2024. That is infrastructure that has been tested with real money. India's rupee Vostro accounts are processing oil trade with Russia, goods trade with Southeast Asia, and bilateral settlements with 26 countries. That is infrastructure in active commercial use. The pattern of previous de-dollarization discussions, where the announcement preceded the infrastructure, has been reversed. The infrastructure is being built first, quietly, without announcements designed to attract diplomatic friction. One analysis from Asia Times described the approach directly. By prioritizing infrastructure over launching a new currency, the bloc makes a pragmatic bet that practical systems will reshape global finance more than symbolic gestures. Its avoidance of headline-grabbing moves may make it more consequential. That is the most important sentence in the strategic assessment of where this is going. Practical systems are more consequential than symbolic gestures, and practical systems, once built, are used. Once used at scale, they create network effects. Once network effects accumulate, the infrastructure becomes self-reinforcing. This is how every major infrastructure transition in history has worked. Railroads did not replace shipping lanes through a single decisive event. They built parallel capacity, demonstrated economic efficiency, accumulated users, and over decades restructured global trade flows. The internet did not replace telecommunications overnight. It built parallel infrastructure, expanded incrementally, and eventually became the primary layer. Dollar alternatives are at the early to middle stage of that process. Now let me address the counter-argument that is most frequently deployed to dismiss this analysis. The counter-argument runs, there is no viable alternative to the dollar. The yuan is not fully convertible. No BRICS currency exists. SWIFT alternatives process a fraction of global volume. The dollar's network effects are self-reinforcing. Nothing can replace it in any near-term time frame. Every statement in that counter-argument is factually accurate, and every statement misses the point, because the countries building alternative payment infrastructure are not trying to replace the dollar. They are trying to make dollar dependency optional. There is a fundamental difference between those two objectives. Replacing the dollar requires building something that is better in every dimension, more liquid, more trusted, more widely accepted, more legally protected. That is an extraordinarily high bar that no current alternative meets. Making dollar dependency optional only requires building something that works well enough to conduct trade and settle payments in bilateral and regional relationships without requiring the dollar. That bar is much lower, and it is being cleared right now. When India can settle oil purchases from Russia in rupees and rubles, India is not replacing the dollar. It is reducing the specific transactions for which it needs the dollar. When China can settle LNG purchases with the UAE in yuan, China is not replacing the dollar. It is building optionality, the ability to conduct this transaction without the dollar if the geopolitical environment ever makes dollar use problematic. Optionality is valuable even if it is rarely exercised. An emergency exit in a building is valuable even if the building never catches fire. The people who installed the exit are not predicting that the building will burn. They are managing the risk that it might. The countries building alternative payment infrastructure are managing the risk that their dollar dependency might, at some future moment they cannot predict, become a liability rather than an asset. That is not anti-Americanism, that is risk management. And the more countries build that risk management infrastructure, the more useful it becomes, because more counterparties can participate in alternative settlement, increasing the network effects of the alternatives and decreasing the marginal cost of using them. The process is self-reinforcing, not in the sense that it inevitably leads to dollar collapse, in the sense that once started, it becomes progressively easier and more economically rational to continue. Let me now explain what the data tells us about how fast this process is moving, because the pace matters for how to think about it. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from 72% in 2001 to 57% in 2025. That is a decline of 15 percentage points over 24 years, less than a percentage point per year. At that pace, the dollar remains dominant in reserves for decades. The structural argument for de-dollarization does not require it to happen quickly. It requires it to happen, but the pace of infrastructure construction has accelerated dramatically. The number of bilateral currency swap agreements involving non-dollar currencies has increased significantly. The transaction volume through CIPS doubled between 2022 and 2024. The digital yuan's transaction volume grew 800% in 2 years. mBridge moved from concept to operational in 3 years. Infrastructure builds faster than behavior changes. The infrastructure being built today will support a transaction volume 10 years from now that does not yet exist because the users who would use it do not yet exist. Countries are onboarding to alternative settlement systems, training their banking sectors, establishing regulatory frameworks, and building the institutional knowledge to use non-dollar infrastructure effectively. That process is happening now. The transactions will follow. The relationship between the infrastructure calendar and the transition timeline is not linear. Infrastructure builds for years without visible impact on transaction share, and then the network effects accumulate, and the share shifts faster than anyone anticipated. That pattern, slow infrastructure accumulation, followed by faster than expected adoption, has characterized every major financial infrastructure transition in modern history. Let me close with the observation that I believe captures what is actually happening in a single analytical frame. The dollar system has two components. There is the dollar's value, what a dollar buys, what its purchasing power is relative to other currencies and real goods. And there is the dollar system's architecture, the payment rails, the settlement systems, the correspondent banking networks, the legal frameworks through which the dollar conducts global commerce. Most public discussion of de-dollarization focuses on the first component. Most institutional action is focused on the second. The dollar's value remains broadly stable relative to other currencies. The dollar system's architecture is losing the characteristic that made it uniquely valuable, its claim to be neutral, apolitical infrastructure that serves all participants equally regardless of their relationship with the United States. That claim has been compromised, not by the dollar's value declining, by the demonstration that the architecture can be turned into a weapon. Once that demonstration has been made, the neutrality claim cannot be fully recovered. Countries that once treated dollar system access as ambient infrastructure, like electricity or water, something you depend on without thinking about its vulnerability, now treat it as a conditional dependency, something that could be withdrawn, and rational actors managing long-duration exposures to a conditional dependency build exits. Countries are slowly building exits from a system they no longer fully trust, not because they have somewhere better to go, because they have decided that any dependency they cannot exit if they need to is a dependency they cannot afford. That is the shift. Not from dollars to something else, from assuming the dollar system is permanent infrastructure to treating it as one option among several, an option that requires alternatives in reserve, just in case. Subscribe to Capital Briefing now if this video changed how you think about the structural motivation behind de-dollarization and what it means for the long-term dollar system. Turn on notifications. Leave one comment, one honest assessment. If you were a central bank governor of a mid-sized economy today, a country with no adversarial relationship with the United States, but significant dollar exposure, what percentage of your reserves would you hold in alternative assets, and why? Because the central bank governors who have already answered that question are acting on their answers right now. The exits are being built. Whether you see them depends on where you are looking.